In September 1977, in a prison courtyard in Marseille, France, a blade fell for the last time. The sound echoed through the morning air, marking the end of an era that most people assumed had concluded decades earlier. This wasn't a medieval execution. This wasn't even from the early 1900s. This happened while Star Wars dominated movie theaters and disco music filled dance floors across the Western world. The guillotine. When you hear that word, your mind likely conjures images of the French Revolution, of crowds gathering in public squares, of a different century entirely. Yet this device, synonymous with 18th century revolutionary fervor, continued its grim work well into the modern age. The last person executed by guillotine in France died the same year the first Star Wars film was released. But here's the question that historians and legal scholars continue to debate. Why did France maintain this apparently archaic method of execution for so long? Why, when other nations had moved to lethal injection, electric chairs, or simply abolished capital punishment altogether, did the French Republic continue to rely on a device invented in 1792? The answer isn't what you might expect. It wasn't tradition for tradition's sake. It wasn't mere bureaucratic inertia or national stubbornness. The reason the guillotine persisted into the eras of color television and space exploration reveals something profound about how societies rationalize violence, how governments maintain control through the appearance of precision, and how the language of humanitarianism can be used to preserve practices that seem anything but humane. This is the story of why efficiency, not cruelty, kept the guillotine alive long after the world had moved on. To understand why the guillotine lasted until 1977, we must first understand what it replaced and what it represented when it was introduced. Before the guillotine, execution methods in France varied dramatically based on social class. Nobles were granted the privilege of beheading by sword, a relatively quick death when performed by a skilled executioner. Commoners, however, faced hanging, breaking on the wheel, or burning at the stake, methods that could be prolonged and agonizing. The guillotine was born from Enlightenment ideals. Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine, despite popular belief, didn't invent the device that bears his name, but he championed its adoption in 1789 on humanitarian grounds. His argument was simple and persuasive. All citizens, regardless of rank, deserved an equal and swift death. The machine would eliminate human error, the variable skill of executioners, and the prolonged suffering of botched executions. The French Revolution embraced this tool enthusiastically. Between 1792 and 1794, during the Reign of Terror, it became the symbol of revolutionary justice. But here's what's crucial. Even after the revolution ended, even after Napoleon rose and fell, even after France cycled through empires, republics and monarchies, the guillotine remained the official method of execution. Through the 19th century, through 2 world wars, through the fall of colonial empires and the rise of modern democracy, this device continued to function. It executed criminals, collaborators, and resistance fighters. It operated during the Paris Commune, through the Third Republic, and into the Fourth and Fifth Republics. By the mid-20th century, executions had moved from public squares to prison courtyards away from crowds and cameras, but the method remained unchanged. This continuity wasn't accidental. It was maintained through deliberate policy decisions, legal frameworks, and a particular philosophy about state power and criminal justice that would prove remarkably resistant to change. Here's the detail that seems impossible to modern ears. While France was hosting the Olympics in 1924, developing nuclear weapons in the 1960s, and building the Concorde supersonic jet in the 1970s, the same basic execution device from 1792 remained in service. The guillotine used in 1977 was not fundamentally different from the one used in 1793. Think about what changed in those 185 years. Medicine advanced from leeches to heart transplants. Communication evolved from handwritten letters to satellite television. Transportation progressed from horse-drawn carriages to moon landings, yet the method by which the French state ended human life remained frozen in the 18th century. This wasn't due to lack of awareness about alternatives. French officials knew about electric chairs, gas chambers, and lethal injection. They knew other nations had abolished capital punishment entirely. International organizations, human rights groups, and domestic activists regularly challenged France's continued use of both the death penalty and this particular method. But the guillotine persisted. And it persisted precisely because of its antiquity, not despite it. The device had accumulated nearly 2 centuries of legal precedent, technical documentation, and administrative procedure. Every component was specified. Every action was codified. The exact angle of the blade, the height of the lunette that held the condemned person's neck, the weight required for the mouton that drove the blade downward, all of this had been refined, tested, and documented over generations. This wasn't just a piece of equipment. It was an entire system of execution embedded in French law, complete with regulations about maintenance, operation, and disposal. Changing it would require not just adopting a new device, but dismantling 2 centuries of legal architecture. And there was another reason, more subtle but perhaps more important. The guillotine could be presented as humane, even civilized, in ways that other methods could not. The guillotine's continued use rested on a single, powerful argument: mechanical reliability. Unlike hanging, which depended on calculating the correct drop distance for the condemned person's weight, or the electric chair, which could malfunction, the guillotine was governed by simple physics. Gravity pulled a weighted blade downward through guides. The only variables were the sharpness of the blade and the maintenance of the apparatus. French officials and executioners could point to this mechanical simplicity as proof of humanitarianism. The device required no special skill to operate once assembled. There was no risk of a poorly tied noose, no possibility of insufficient voltage, no danger of a firing squad missing vital organs. The blade fell at a consistent speed determined by gravity. Death was, in theory, instantaneous. This emphasis on reliability served multiple purposes for the French state. First, it transformed an act of violence into an administrative procedure. The guillotine wasn't about punishment or suffering. It was about efficient implementation of a court sentence. Second, it insulated individual executioners from moral responsibility. They weren't killing anyone. They were simply operating a machine that physics determined would function in a specific way. The technical specifications were exhaustively documented. The blade, made of steel and weighing approximately 40 kilograms, fell from a height of 2.3 meters. The mouton, the weighted block that held the blade, added another 30 kilograms. The combined weight and velocity produced by this drop generated sufficient force to sever the neck in a fraction of a second, reportedly faster than pain signals could travel to the brain. These specifications weren't just technical details, they were legal shields. Any challenge to the guillotine's use could be met with precise measurements, documented procedures, and decades of consistent application. The device's very mechanism made it defensible in ways that newer, less tested methods might not be. Beyond its mechanical properties, the guillotine carried symbolic weight that proved difficult for the French state to abandon. It represented a particular vision of justice, egalitarian, rational, and administered without passion or prejudice. To replace it would be to admit that this vision had been flawed all along. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, public executions by guillotine served as powerful demonstrations of state authority. Crowds gathered not for entertainment, though spectacle was certainly present, but to witness the state's power over life and death. The guillotine stood as a monument to the law's supremacy, to the idea that no individual, regardless of wealth or status, stood above the collective will, as expressed through the judicial system. When France ended public executions in 1939, moving them behind prison walls, the symbolism shifted but didn't disappear. Now the guillotine represented something else: the state's willingness to do what was necessary, however unpleasant, to maintain order. The fact that executions happened in private, witnessed only by officials, lawyers, and sometimes journalists, emphasized their administrative rather than theatrical nature. This privatization also protected the guillotine from public scrutiny. Unlike the electric chair in America, which generated disturbing reports of botched executions and burning flesh, or hanging, which could produce grotesque images of struggling victims, the guillotine performed its function away from cameras and crowds. Its reputation for efficiency could be maintained precisely because few people witnessed its actual operation in modern times. For French officials defending capital punishment, the guillotine offered a crucial advantage. It could be presented as the least cruel option available. They could argue that France was actually more humane than countries using newer methods, because the guillotine's simplicity eliminated the possibility of technical failure. This rhetorical position allowed France to maintain capital punishment while still claiming adherence to Enlightenment values of reason and humanitarianism. Several myths have attached themselves to the guillotine over the centuries, and understanding what's false helps clarify what's true about its persistence into 1977. The most persistent myth is that the guillotine was uniquely French, or that France was somehow backward for continuing to use it. In reality, several countries employed similar devices well into the 20th century. Germany used the fall bail, essentially identical to the guillotine, for executions until 1949 in West Germany and 1966 in East Germany. Belgium maintained the guillotine until 1950. Sweden used it until capital punishment was abolished in 1910. France was actually among the last, but not alone in retaining this method deep into the modern era. Another common misconception is that the guillotine's use until 1977 reflected some peculiar French attachment to revolutionary symbolism or national tradition. The reality is more prosaic. The guillotine remained because changing execution methods required legislative action, and no French legislature wanted to spend political capital debating how best to kill people when they could simply maintain the existing system. The path of least resistance was doing nothing. There's also a myth that the guillotine was painless and that victims were unaware of what happened. While the device was certainly quick, the question of consciousness after decapitation troubled even 18th century observers. Experiments in the years following the French Revolution suggested that some neural activity might persist briefly after severing the head. However, official French position maintained that death was instantaneous, and this position was rarely challenged by the 1970s. Perhaps the most important myth to dispel is that the guillotine was maintained out of cruelty or vindictiveness. The truth is more disturbing. It was maintained out of bureaucratic convenience and a genuine, if misguided, belief that it represented the most humane option available. The road to 1977 was paved with good intentions and administrative inertia. The guillotine's application was not uniform throughout its long history. Understanding these variations reveals how execution methods adapt to political circumstances while maintaining institutional continuity. During the French Revolution, the guillotine operated almost continuously. Records suggest that during the height of the terror in 1794, the device might execute dozens of people in a single day. The pace was industrial, the process streamlined to handle volume, but this was exceptional. Through most of the 19th and 20th centuries, executions occurred sporadically, sometimes with years between uses in certain jurisdictions. Different regions of France maintained their own guillotines, each with slight variations in construction and maintenance. By the 20th century, many of these regional devices had been retired, and a single guillotine, carefully maintained and transported as needed, served the entire nation. The centralization reflected broader trends in French administration, where local variation gave way to national standardization. The setting and ceremony around executions changed dramatically over time. Revolutionary-era executions were theatrical events designed to educate and intimidate. By contrast, executions in the 1970s were private, solemn affairs conducted in the early morning hours with minimal witness presence. The condemned person was no longer paraded through streets or subjected to public humiliation before death. Interestingly, occupied France during World War II saw both French and German authorities conducting executions. The Vichy regime continued using the guillotine for civil criminals, while Nazi occupation forces used it for resistance fighters and political prisoners. After liberation, the guillotine was employed against collaborators. The same device, the same method, served drastically different political purposes depending on who controlled it. These variations demonstrate that while the physical apparatus remained consistent, its social meaning and application were highly flexible. The guillotine could be revolutionary terror or state justice, public spectacle or private administration, depending on the historical moment. This adaptability paradoxically contributed to its longevity. On September 10, 1977, Hamida Jandoubi became the last person executed by guillotine anywhere in the world. His case illuminates why the device persisted and why it would finally disappear. Jandoubi was a Tunisian immigrant convicted of torturing and murdering his former girlfriend. His trial attracted little public attention. The execution, conducted at Beaumet's prison in Marseille, was witnessed by a small group of officials and one journalist. There were no protests outside, no media circus, no national debate. The guillotine did its work in the darkness of early morning, and France continued as if nothing had happened. But something significant had happened. By 1977, France stood nearly alone among Western democracies in maintaining capital punishment. The European Convention on Human Rights, which France had ratified, was increasingly interpreted as incompatible with the death penalty. International pressure was mounting, not from governments, but from human rights organizations and shifting public opinion. The guillotine's use in the Jandoubi case highlighted an uncomfortable reality. France was executing people using an 18th century device while simultaneously positioning itself as a leader in human rights and European integration. The contradiction became harder to ignore or rationalize. What's crucial to understand is that Jandoubi's execution didn't immediately end the guillotine. The device remained ready, legally authorized, technically maintained. It could have been used again. The reason it wasn't had nothing to do with the guillotine itself and everything to do with broader political changes. François Mitterrand, elected president in 1981, appointed Robert Badinter as Minister of Justice. Badinter, whose father had been killed at Auschwitz and who had personally witnessed the effects of capital punishment as a defense lawyer, made abolition his priority. In 1981, the French National Assembly voted to abolish the death penalty entirely. The guillotine was finally retired, not because it had failed, but because the political will to preserve capital punishment itself had collapsed. So why did the guillotine continue until 1977? The answer is layered, but ultimately clear. It persisted because it embodied a particular bureaucratic logic that made changing it harder than maintaining it. The device represented nearly 2 centuries of legal precedent, technical documentation, and administrative procedure. It had been refined and rationalized to the point where it could be presented as humane, even civilized. Its mechanical simplicity meant it could be operated without specialized expertise, defended without empirical uncertainty, and maintained without significant expense. More fundamentally, the The guillotine allowed French society to avoid confronting uncomfortable questions about capital punishment itself. By focusing on method rather than morality, officials could debate the guillotine's efficiency without debating whether the state should be executing anyone at all. The device became a substitute for deeper ethical examination. The guillotine's longevity reveals how societies use technical language and procedural precision to obscure violence. By transforming execution into an administrative process governed by physics and engineering, France made state killing seem irrational, even inevitable. The blade fell because gravity pulled it downward. Death occurred because the mechanism functioned as designed. No one was responsible. The system simply operated. This is the guillotine's true obscure reason for persistence. It converted moral questions into technical ones. It allowed officials to speak of angles, weights, and velocities instead of life, death, and justice. It provided the comforting illusion that execution could be made humane through engineering refinement. When we look at that final execution in 1977, we see not an anachronism, but a culmination. The guillotine lasted so long because it perfected what all capital punishment systems seek, a way to make killing seem systematic, inevitable, and beyond individual moral responsibility. The blade fell the same way in 1977 as it did in 1793, driven by the same force, guided by the same mechanism, justified by the same language of efficiency and humanitarianism. The guillotine that executed Hamida Jandoubi is now in a museum, a relic of a France that believed state killing could be rationalized through mechanical precision, but the lessons it teaches remain relevant. We continue to see governments using technical language to obscure moral questions. We see administrative procedures designed to distribute responsibility so thinly that no individual must bear its full weight. We see systems that function smoothly, efficiently, and with apparent neutrality, while performing actions that would horrify us if we examine them clearly. The guillotine's persistence until 1977 reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that modernity can coexist with practices we'd like to believe belong to the past, and that the language of efficiency and humanitarianism can be deployed to justify almost anything. The device was presented as humane because it was quick. Its simplicity was offered as evidence of its moral superiority. Its mechanical nature absolved operators of personal responsibility. These are the same arguments we hear today about drone strikes, automated weapon systems, and algorithmic decision-making in criminal justice. The technology changes, but the underlying logic remains. If we can make violence systematic and precise, if we can remove human judgment and emotion from the process, then somehow that violence becomes more acceptable. The guillotine's final fall in 1977 marked not just the end of a device, but the collapse of a particular way of thinking about state power and violence. It took France 185 years to recognize that efficiency doesn't equal morality, that precision doesn't equal justice, and that mechanical reliability doesn't make killing humane. The blade may have fallen for the last time in 1977, but the mindset that sustained it for nearly 2 centuries persists in new forms, using new technologies, justified by new rhetoric that sounds remarkably similar to the old. Thank you for watching. If you found this exploration of hidden historical details compelling, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the obscure reasons behind historical practices. What other historical objects or practices should we examine? Share your thoughts in the comments below.